In fact, New Community Media Alliance started an effort to try to populate the ethnic and community media more with the stories which are related to the media policy related issues. Wanted to see how this media is responding to, of course, the challenges were always there on the media policy front, and issues were always there, but the debate was missing in the ethnic and community media, despite the fact that this sector has huge stakes in the policies that are related to this media policy. So we held that discussion and we found that the level of understanding, not to talk of reporting and covering these issues, was very low. That debate is even still missing. Though we have seen examples where people have reported on the subject, but those are very few, and it needs to happen at a bigger scale because the stakes are high, and these are very across the board and relates to every community.
The journalists are going to talk about what worked for them and what didn't in covering the stories on media policy, and what challenges they encountered. We're going to talk about that especially, and then we're going to talk about what stories worked for them and why. And then
Mohsin Zahir, I'm from Sadai, Pakistan, New York. I have no idea what media policy means to me, to my readers, or and then digital divide, net neutrality, bill shocks, and all other these kind of issues. All these terminologies were a kind of alien terminology for me. To New York Community Media Alliance, thanks to Josh, when we sat down with him first day, he said, what do you know about net neutrality? So we were looking at each other's face. I said, we don't know about what net neutrality is and what does it mean. But when he explained, then we find out this is the issue underneath of us, and this is a very big and huge issue, and it is related to not ordinary people, it relates to immigrant communities, and especially with immigrant communities confronting with the language barriers and other issues. So for them, the level of awareness about these ongoing issues is very minimal.
Any other journalists care to tackle this question of challenges to reporting about media policy issues?
On top of Martian said,
Say it loudly.
landscaping who to approach sort of making first steps ourselves in the field. And thank you, Josh, for throwing names of people who could contact and organizations, and that was really helpful to make first steps and then go further. But one of the challenges also for me was talking to regular people. And in my community, I felt like the awareness of net neutrality was -2. Bill shock was maybe 0. So what I tried to do was not to throw those names at them, but just to sort of maybe sketch the problem, or even not sketching the problem, but asking them questions that might be helpful for them to tell me their story. Once I told them about net neutrality, people would not believe me that it would be possible to actually obstruct their way to free internet. They were like, what are you talking about? This is not possible. So net neutrality is something that's grounded in people's mentality and in their minds, and it's unthinkable for most of the people that it could be limited for that.
Follow up on both the points, because I think this is what's happened in no matter what story I did in whatever the community it is that when I was able to talk to an advocate or an expert early on and have that discussion without deadline hitting me, and I can understand what we're talking about, it was a much better story, because then I could convey that in my own interviews with community people and other ones. When it wasn't successful, of course, was when I had the pressure of deadline, and I started trying to do a story and without the thorough understanding. So one of the great things that advocates can do, and I think it's incumbent upon reporters to do this as well, is to actually go out and talk to people well before the pressure's on us.
if I want to report research, I think I totally agree with two of them, like New Yorkers, and so basically, how to explain these technical terms to normal people. Because normal people, they are caring about how much money we're going to cost, and so what kind of technology, what kind of functions I will have. So now this very technical word. So basically, we just need to translate all these technical words into common or maybe plain English people can understand. I think that's the most challenges for reporters. So when they touch these media policy issues.
There's a call for perhaps regular or casual briefings and relationship building between media policy advocates and reporters so that you're constantly able to, once you build a foundation for understanding net neutrality or other issues, like you're able to move forward and begin to report off of that.
Neutrality is, what you see in local newspapers is net neutrality tends to be an AP story and done by, the National Wire, and they rarely localize it, and they rarely interpret it and how it impacts people within their community. So that was my thought, was like selling it to the, editors.
What about resource issues? Because these stories are locally based, and if they're going to get picked up, they do get picked up more by the local media, and especially hyperlocals now. But there are resource issues going on about how to report this. Anybody?
Well, for ethnic and community media, I know there's a different gatekeeper, but for mainstream media, I think there's also the temptation of not localizing the story because it's just cheaper to do a policy story. And unfortunately, we can get really broken down, we can get really consumed by like keeping score of who's winning in Washington and the bureaucracy of this media policy. And like right now, the stories happening right now that we see about what Congress decided to repeal or whatever, you just get this kind of scorecard type of thing without anybody really explaining what this is. Because most people are seeing net neutrality, Republicans won again, but they don't even know what they're talking about. And that, I think, one thing that we need to do collectively, I think, is break through that with our editors.
I just was going to say that I think there's a real opportunity for advocates when there's a national story to actually localize it or community, put it to a community angle to the reporter. And I think what you do is that you go and tell them, this is a community break on this and this is what can happen. And also think about the story in layers. It's a political story, it's a human story, it's an economic story.
Well, John Rudolph, I think one of the issues is that if you approach media policy as a policy story, everybody's eyes glaze over. I think we have to humanize this. We have to tell this. We have to bring it to the level of human interaction. So we ran a story, I think it was last year, on the 52 Worlds blog about people in the Mexican American community in LA who were using projecting, they were telling stories, they were recording these little movies and stuff about their lives, and then they were distributing on cell phones and iPads and this sort of thing. And that was, we got a lot of hits, we got a lot of comments on that story because it was the stories that the people were telling about their lives were interesting. And we're kind of sneaking the media policy in underneath there to. So I think that it needs to be reframed. It's like, not how do we report on media policy, because policy stuff, whether it's healthcare or tax or whatever, is always really hard to report on, particularly if you're just a general assignment reporter and you got to cover a whole lot of different subjects. But if you can find a piece of that human story, and I think that that's where we need to be focusing more with the resources that are available to immigrant media and community media.
That really is a very important point. It's like you got to find the human interest first and then have it kind of lead to the policy issue.
I think, and this is something that our fellowships tried to inculcate into the reporting, was we had our fellows go out and actually find specific examples where their people's lives were going to be directly impacted by the changes in the internet. In this case, we were looking at net neutrality on my fellowship, and then there were general issues around bill shock and other things that your reporters were covering that people could relate to. And we're finding that that's probably the best way to go, but still, even then, I know that a couple of my reporters were really frustrated in the backgrounding that they got from talking to advocates on the issue. And so these are realities that these reporters have to deal with that are not actually considered when they're approached by spokespeople from various organizations on this issue. How well advocates understand the contingencies and the actual news environment that people are working in. I'd like to hear more from you reporters about those stories. So can we talk about that? For instance,
It's very interesting. It happened today. When I was coming to Boston, I got a call from one of my readers. He's also my friend. He said, "Where are you going?" I said, "I'm going to Boston." He said, "For what?" I said, "For a conference." And he said, "What's the topic?" So I know if I'm going to tell him it's about net neutrality, digital divide, or bill shock, it will pass from his head. So I tell him, I tell Ijaz, "Do you know AT&T buy T-Mobile?" He said, "Yes." I said, "AT&T does not buy T-Mobile. AT&T actually buy you. You are T-Mobile customer." He said, what do you mean?" I said, "You pay a certain amount of money to T-Mobile. Now you are going to pay certain amount of money to AT&T." And he said, "All right." So I said, "So he buy you. Do you know at what price you are sold?" He said, "No." I said, "So before so it is very important for you to know at what price AT&T bought you, because by the time you know all the things, you may get caught with the contract. So you cannot leave AT&T now. You said I was paying $50 to T-Mobile. So why should one fine morning you will receive a letter from T-Mobile? You have to pay now $75, and you are under 2 years contract and this and this." He said, "Oh my God, this is very interesting. When you go to Boston, speak aloud a lot of good things." So so this is what. So I think all these issues. Same thing with net neutrality. When I have a first meeting with Josh, when I come back to my office, I talk to my publisher. I said, "Do you know in our room, in our office, there is a digital divide, net neutrality issue?" She said, "No." When I explained to her, she said, "Oh yes, these are the issues in our office. These are the issues down the street. These are the issues in our communities." So I think the very good thing is being done, like NICMA, other consumer advocates and people in this hall. I think you are serving directly to the people, to immigrant communities. So all these issues are very important to ordinary people. And as an immigrant reporter or a news person, I think for our community, they need more attentions to be paid. Why? Because of the language barriers, number one. The second is they are so much involved in their day-to-day challenges, so they don't have much general knowledge about ongoing issues.
It's a really great point because, it was when we were talking about net neutrality, it was kind of like an opaque wall that we had to somehow break through. But now that this AT&T T-Mobile merger has come along, there's a lot of really great examples, and it is kind of like making a celebration out of a disaster. The examples that I'm talking about are the fact that ethnic people are exactly the customers who are going to be affected the most. They're the
right, and I think from an advocacy point of view, that since you're so much more in touch with those things that are about to happen, that if you were able to plug into that particular need right away when it comes to reporting on this issue as it's breaking, then we can actually turn out much better stories.
I think that journalists, part of our job really is to take all this policy and drill it down and frame it. So to me, like for example, net neutrality, you frame it as whatever it is. It could be a personal story, as you were saying, it could be a political story. For me, it depends on who it is. For me, it's
If there were some formal venues for educating journalists to give them the background that they could then understand and bring when they go out and talk to people on the street about this, I think that would be very helpful.
Yeah.
And I would refer to what Joe said at the very beginning, and that is the perspective as well, which is missing when the reports are coming. When we leave it to the mainstream media or the media that may be serving special interests, then we will get the perspective that may not be ours. And
it just takes time. You're not gonna get the story right the first time, the second, third. But the more you're able to do the story, and you really believe in it, that is about democracy. Over time, it's gonna start making sense. It just takes time. This is not an easy issue at all. So
I think it's really to think about all these different pieces of the ecosystem. That actually, if we go back a number of years, think about the first year we had this conference in 2003, really did not exist. People in DC who are working on these issues daily, the coordinated ethnic press organizations, and the community media organizations that have a real eye on policy. So I think that we're really at a point now with that ecosystem is in a good shape.
Is expressing this to the FCC and the folks in Washington, to Congress, because while we have this dialogue in here, there are back deals being made in Washington, and they don't hear this at all.
And on Ravi's perfectly valid point, I don't know the answer, but I think whatever media reform and justice and sort of policy lobbying power we have in DC, and it's not very much, I do think that it needs more forms of egress in terms of setting the agenda. And
so what we need to do is understand what, by asking questions about how things are actually being lived, then we can actually use the policy as the opportunity, as the hook.
Helpful story is a small story. It's not as big as the story we actually need to tell about changing the media in this country. And one thing that I get from hearing the reporters today talk is about the need to humanize a story and to have characters in a story. And I knew this, but to think more about how can we be ready with the characters that aren't us and say, I have got some people for you to talk to. These people need a radio station. There's a community that's never had access to media, and here's what they're going to change in their community.
talking about the inside the Beltway creates policy, it doesn't have to be like that. It creates the agenda, because change honestly comes from outside in. But our power doesn't come from inside strategy. I mean, we're at the mercy of these corporations and the lawmakers. And if you think you're going to play an inside game and win because you have an intellectual argument, you're not. Right. Because facts don't matter in Washington. It don't. It don't. So Prometheus is an example of an organization that had its own vision on what it wanted to do in D.C. And the people in D.C., like myself, went along for the ride. We helped them out. We helped them out as far as lobbying, but they did their own lobbying. Lawyers, because they didn't have lawyers. But the vision was all theirs. And creating an outside-in movement where folks all around the country were contacting their local member of Congress and being a pain in the ass to get them on these bills.
Corruption involved with the prison phone call systems for people trapped in the criminal justice system is a story that needs to be told. I think the privatization and ongoing destruction of the public access, public educational and governmental channels, television channels and community organizations in communities all across the country, and basically the abnegation of the cable franchise obligation to give back for the monopoly.
Need for connection and relationship building between advocates and journalists, and not only from the end of advocates cannot perform well under 4-minute deadline pressure, and journalists, if you want a good story, have a lunch date, have some sort of conversation where you start to build upon baseline knowledge of these big, bulky technical issues. And it takes time and it's a big investment, but that seems to be a need that's going both ways, is knowing each other better. On the advocate side, journalists see a need for more characters in their stories. They see their stories needing to be less about policy and more layered out into political stories, human interest stories, community stories. So advocates, how can you be better acting as a portal for reporters to connect people with communities that are being directly impacted around issues, and what are the strategies that you can undertake to help direct reporters in proactive directions or in proactive ways. There is education and training, and this totally goes on both ends. I see reporters talking about needing to understand key players, key terms, key issues, so that when something huge breaks, like they don't know, like, oh my God, I have no idea how to talk about like what exactly is happening with FCC communications briefings, and strategy assistance can you all get that will help you think more strategically about stories that you're wanting to tell, so that the frame isn't stolen from you, and so that you're able to like frame an issue and ground it in your communities. I think those are like the two big like intersecting items that I've been able to see out of this. So human interest, training and education, and relationships. So that's actually 3. Sorry, it's getting late. It's hard to count.